My wife made me wait 4 hours at an expensive restaurant for my birthday dinner. When she finally arrived with her friends, she loudly said, "See, told you he'd still be here like a pathetic dog." They all laughed. We'd been together 4 years, and I'd just paid off her parents' mortgage. I smiled, ordered another drink. This morning, my phone shows 278 missed calls and her belongings are in garbage bags at the dump. So here's how it all started. And trust me, the irony isn't lost on me that it began with water damage. Because apparently, the universe has a sense of humor darker than my morning coffee and twice as bitter. It was a Tuesday in March, and Mother Nature had decided to throw one hell of a tantrum the night before. I'm talking about the kind of storm that makes you question your life choices while you're lying in bed listening to what sounds like God himself rearranging the furniture upstairs. The wind was howling like a banshee with commitment issues, and the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like someone was power washing the building with a fire hose. I should have known something was wrong when I woke up to what I initially thought was the world's most persistent alarm clock. Turns out, it wasn't my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was water dripping from my ceiling onto the hardwood floor with the rhythm of a really annoying metronome. Drip, 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 each drop landing with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Except instead of keeping time, it was keeping score of how royally screwed my security deposit was about to be. Picture this. Me, standing there in my boxer shorts and a faded college t-shirt that had seen better decades, staring up at a ceiling that looked like it had been through a blender. The paint was peeling in strips that hung down like sad party streamers, and there was a stain spreading across the white surface that looked suspiciously like the outline of either Florida or a very unfortunate birthmark. Water was cascading down in what I can only describe as an indoor waterfall experience that nobody asked for and certainly nobody wanted to pay for. I did what any rational adult would do in this situation. I stood there for a solid 5 minutes, coffee mug in hand, watching the disaster unfold like I was binge-watching a particularly depressing Netflix series. Then I grabbed every pot, pan, bucket, and Tupperware container I owned and turned my living room into what looked like a percussion section, having a nervous breakdown. That's when I called the building management, because apparently, I still had faith in the system back then. Cute, right? The guy on the phone. Let's call him Gary because he sounded exactly like every Gary who's ever disappointed you. Told me in the most monotone voice imaginable that they'd send someone over as soon as possible. In landlord speak, that translates to sometime between now and the heat death of the universe, but probably closer to the latter. 2 hours later, I'm sitting in my makeshift indoor rainstorm, working from my laptop because deadlines wait for no ceiling catastrophe, when there's a knock at my door. I opened it to find this contractor guy, built like he actually knew what tools were for, wearing work boots that had seen some serious action, and carrying a toolbox that looked like it could survive a nuclear apocalypse. His name tag said Tarek, and he had this apprentice with him who couldn't have been older than 22 and looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. Tarek took one look at my ceiling and let out this low whistle that somehow managed to convey both professional assessment and personal sympathy. "Well," he said, scratching his beard, "that's not supposed to be doing that. Thanks, Captain Obvious. Really earning that contractor fee. But here's where the story gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean where my life took a left turn into crazy town without so much as a GPS warning. I'm standing there explaining the timeline of my ceiling's mental breakdown to Tarek when I hear this voice from the hallway. Holy crap, Adrian, did your apartment finally give up on life? I turned around, and there she was, Sloan Martinez from 4B, holding an armload of towels and wearing this smile that was equal parts amused and sympathetic. She lived 2 doors down, and up until that moment, our relationship had consisted entirely of polite hallway nods and the occasional, nice whether we're having small talk that neighbors excel at. But there she was, looking at my disaster zone with these bright green eyes that seemed to find the whole situation genuinely entertaining rather than tragic. She was wearing jeans that fit like they were specifically designed for her, and a sweater that was probably more expensive than my monthly grocery budget. But she was standing in my doorway offering help like we'd been friends for years. "You look like a man drowning in his own apartment," she said, and I swear to God, the way she said it made it sound like a compliment. There was this hint of a smirk playing at the corner of her mouth, like she was letting me in on some private joke that only the two of us understood. And you know what? She was absolutely right. I did look like I was drowning. Not just in the literal sense of being surrounded by water and chaos, but in that particular kind of adult drowning where you're technically keeping your head above water, but you're definitely not swimming. I was treading water in a life that was functional but not exactly thriving, managing but not excelling, existing but not really living. Sloan handed me the towels. Good towels, the kind that actually absorb water instead of just moving it around, and started helping me strategically place them around the worst of the damage. She had this way of moving through the chaos that made it seem manageable, like she'd dealt with ceiling disasters before, or maybe just had one of those personalities that made everything seem less catastrophic by default. This happened to my friend's place last year, she said, expertly positioning a towel to catch a particularly aggressive drip. The key is to not let it become a thing, you know? Just another Tuesday adventure. She said it with this casual confidence that made me believe her, like she'd appointed herself the official spokesperson for turning disasters into anecdotes. While Tarek and his reluctant apprentice started doing whatever magic contractors do to fix ceiling situations, Sloan and I found ourselves in my kitchen, which was the only room not currently impersonating a water park. She made coffee, somehow finding my good mugs that I'd forgotten I owned, and we talked. Really talked, not the superficial neighbor chit-chat I was used to. She told me about her job at some marketing firm downtown, how she was working on campaigns for restaurants and local businesses, trying to help them find their voice in a crowded market. The way she talked about it, you could tell she actually cared about what she did, that it wasn't just a paycheck, but something she was genuinely invested in. She had opinions about everything. Which coffee shops had the best atmosphere for working, why certain restaurants succeeded while others failed, how the city was changing, and whether that was good or bad. I found myself talking more than I had in months, telling her about my job as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction company. It sounds boring when you say it like that, and honestly, most days it was. I spent my time managing schedules, coordinating between different teams, making sure projects stayed on track and on budget. I was good at it, really good, actually, but it wasn't exactly the kind of work that made for exciting dinner party conversation. But Sloan listened like it was fascinating. She asked questions that made me realize I actually knew more about what I did than I gave myself credit for. She wanted to know about the biggest projects I'd managed, what happened when things went wrong, how I dealt with difficult clients and impossible deadlines. By the time Tarek announced that my ceiling was no longer an active water feature, I felt like I'd been reminded of who I was supposed to be. You should come by for dinner sometime, she said as we were cleaning up the towels and relocating my percussion section of water-catching containers. I make a mean pasta dish, and my kitchen actually has a ceiling that stays where it's supposed to. And that was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not earth-shattering, just a simple invitation delivered with that same slightly sarcastic smile that had greeted my ceiling disaster. I said yes before I'd even processed the question fully, because when someone like Sloan notices you, really notices you, not just the polite neighbor acknowledgement, but actual interest, you don't stop to analyze the lighting. You just bask in the warmth and try not to think too hard about what happens when the sun goes down. Looking back now, with all the wisdom that comes from spectacular relationship failure and the kind of hindsight that's sharper than a surgical scalpel, I can see all the things I should have noticed. But at the time, standing in my damp apartment with this beautiful, charming woman who'd turned my disaster into something that felt like the beginning of an adventure, I wasn't looking for red flags. I was just grateful that someone had shown up with towels and a sense of humor when my world was literally falling apart. Because here's the thing about meeting someone during a crisis. They feel like the solution, even when they're actually just another kind of problem wearing a prettier outfit. 8 months later, I learned that temporary is just another word adults use when they want to lie to themselves about making permanent decisions. Kind of like how we need to talk never actually means we need to talk. It means someone's about to get their emotional teeth kicked in. But hey, at least we're being civilized about it. It started with what I now recognize as the classic relationship bait and switch. Though at the time I was too busy being flattered by the attention to notice I was being played like a fiddle at a bluegrass festival. Sloan showed up at my door on a Thursday night looking like she'd been through an emotional blender, carrying a duffel bag that was clearly packed in a hurry and wearing that specific expression women get when they're about to ask for something they already know you're going to give them. "My roommate's having a complete meltdown," she said, dropping the bag at her feet like she was planting a flag. "Some drama with her ex showing up unannounced, threatening to cause problems with her lease. I just need a place to crash for a few days while she sorts her crap out. You know how it is." Here's the thing, I didn't know how it was. I'd been living alone for 3 years at that point, and I liked it. I had my routines, my space arranged exactly how I wanted it, my Netflix queue perfectly curated for one person's viewing habits. But when someone you're crazy about shows up looking vulnerable and asking for help, you don't exactly start questioning the logistics. You just move your stuff over and pretend like having someone else's toothbrush on your bathroom counter was always part of the plan. "Of course," I said, because apparently I'm the kind of guy who thinks being a human doormat is the same thing as being a good boyfriend. "Stay as long as you need." Famous last words, right up there with what could go wrong. And I'm sure it's nothing. Those few days turned into a week. The week turned into 2 weeks. By week 3, Sloane had somehow acquired a key, her own shelf in my medicine cabinet, and the kind of casual ownership over my space that would have been impressive if it wasn't so completely terrifying. She never officially moved in. There was no conversation about it, no mutual decision-making process, no discussion of rent or utilities or whose name would be on what. She just absorbed into my life like water into a sponge, until suddenly I couldn't remember what my apartment had looked like before her stuff was everywhere. And God, was her stuff everywhere. Designer handbags draped over chairs like expensive scarecrows. Skincare products that cost more than my monthly phone bill lined up on my bathroom counter like tiny soldiers in the war against aging. Clothes that required special hangers and specific folding techniques piled on every available surface. My minimalist apartment had been transformed into something that looked like a Nordstrom had exploded, and somehow I was supposed to pretend this was normal. But the real kicker was the couch situation. I had this perfectly good couch. Okay, perfectly good might be stretching it, but it was comfortable and it was mine. I'd bought it from a thrift store when I first moved in, and it had that broken-in quality that only comes from years of being someone's favorite place to collapse after a long day. It was brown corduroy with a few strategically placed patches and the kind of character that you can't buy in a showroom. Sloane took one look at it and made this face like I'd asked her to sit on a park bench covered in bird droppings. "Adrian, honey," she said, and I should have known right then that any sentence starting with honey in that tone was going to end with me spending money I didn't want to spend. "This couch has got to go. It's practically screaming college dropout who gave up on life." 2 days later, I came home from work to find my beloved corduroy companion gone, just vanished, like it had never existed. And in its place was this pristine white leather monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about people who don't actually live in their homes. It was beautiful, I'll give it that, but it was also completely impractical and approximately 10 times more expensive than anything I would have chosen for myself. "Surprise," Sloane said when I walked in, spreading her arms like a game show hostess revealing the grand prize. "I found it on sale, and I knew you'd love it. It's an investment in our future. Our future. Not the future or your future, but our future." Like she'd already decided we were a package deal, and I'd somehow missed the memo. And the thing is, I should have been bothered by the presumption. I should have asked where my old couch went, or who decided that our future required furniture that looked like it was designed for people who don't eat messy foods or own pets, or have any intention of actually using it for its intended purpose. Instead, I told myself it was motivation to raise my standards. Here was this incredible woman who saw potential in me, who wanted to help me become the kind of person who owned nice things and lived in spaces that didn't look like a college dorm room decorated by someone with no imagination and a tight budget. She was pushing me to be better, and if that came with the minor inconvenience of losing furniture I actually liked, well, that was probably just the price of growth, right? Wrong. So incredibly, spectacularly wrong that if wrongness were an Olympic sport, I would have won gold, silver, and bronze while setting a new world record. But at the time, I was still operating under the delusion that love meant letting someone remake you in their image. So I sat on the white leather couch that felt like sitting on a cloud made of anxiety, Because God forbid I should spill something or leave an indentation or otherwise evidence that a human being actually lived there, and I convinced myself that this was what progress looked like. The daily phone calls to her parents started around week 4 of the temporary arrangement. Every single night, right after dinner, Sloan would dial them up and put them on speaker like we were hosting some kind of family podcast. I'd be doing dishes or trying to read or just existing in my own apartment, and suddenly I'm an unwilling participant in the Lawson family hour. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Dad." She'd chirp into the phone, settling into the white leather couch like she was settling into a throne. "Guess what Adrian did for me today?" And then she'd launch into these elaborate stories about my supposed romantic gestures. How I'd surprised her with coffee. I'd made coffee for both of us because that's what you do when you live with another human being. Or how I'd insisted on carrying her groceries. I'd help carry groceries because I have functioning arms and basic human decency. Or how I'd planned this amazing dinner. I'd cooked food because the alternative was starving. "Adrian treats me like a queen," she'd say, and her parents would make those approving noises that parents make when they think their kid has finally found someone who's going to take good care of them. And I'd be standing there in my own kitchen, holding a dish towel, feeling like I was watching a performance of my own life, where someone else was playing the lead role. The weird part was, I started to believe it. When someone constantly tells other people how wonderful you are, even if they're exaggerating your basic human decency into grand romantic gestures, you start to think maybe you really are that wonderful. Maybe I was the kind of guy who treated women like queens. Maybe I was boyfriend material after all. Then came the Friday night invasion. Sloane's best friends, Trent, Harper, and Naya, had apparently decided that my living room was their new favorite hangout spot. Every Friday, like clockwork, they'd show up with bottles of wine that cost more than my monthly streaming subscriptions combined and an expectation that I'd provide food, entertainment, and a clean space for them to hold court. Trent was one of those guys who managed to make everything sound like a critique disguised as a compliment. "Adrian, this pasta is actually pretty decent," he'd say, like he was surprised I could operate a stove without burning the building down. "You're like a little housewife, but with less complaining." Harper was the queen of backhanded observations. "It's so cute how you just let Sloane redecorate everything," she'd say, gesturing at my transformed living space with her wine glass. "Most guys would be all territorial about their stuff, but you're just so adaptable." And Naya, sweet Naya, who seemed nice enough, but had this way of asking questions that felt like tiny interrogations. "How long have you two been together now? It feels like you've been together forever. Are you thinking about making it official? You know, like really official?" I'd cook for them. Pasta, stir-fry, whatever I could manage on a project coordinator's budget stretched to feed 5 people instead of 1. And they'd critique it like food critics who'd been asked to review a gas station hot dog. Not mean, exactly, but with this casual expectation that I should be grateful for their presence and their opinions about my cooking, my apartment, my life choices. "Adrian's so good to me," Sloane would say, curled up on the white leather couch like a cat who'd found the perfect sunny spot. "He just takes care of everything. I'm so lucky." And I'd stand there in my kitchen, cleaning dishes that I'd cooked food in for people who treated my efforts like a barely acceptable baseline, telling myself that this was what having a social life looked like. This was what being part of a couple meant. I wasn't just Adrian, the project coordinator who lived alone and had quiet weekends anymore. I was Adrian, Sloane's boyfriend, the guy who hosted dinner parties and made sure everyone had enough wine and laughed at jokes that weren't actually funny. My buddy Kaito started asking questions around month 6. We were grabbing beers after work, and he had that look on his face that meant he was about to say something I probably didn't want to hear. "So," he said, picking at the label on his bottle like he was defusing a bomb, "you seem different lately." "Different how?" "I don't know, man. Tired, maybe? Like you're working really hard at something that should be easier." He took a swig of his beer and gave me that look that good friends give you when they're trying to decide whether to mind their own business or stage an intervention. "You do everything for her, right? The cooking, the cleaning, the entertaining her friends, paying for stuff. What does she do for you?" It should have been an easy question to answer. In a healthy relationship, you should be able to rattle off a list of things your partner brings to the table without having to think about it. But I sat there for way too long, staring at my beer and trying to come up with something that didn't sound pathetic. "She chooses me," I finally said, and the words came out faster than I'd intended, like I was trying to convince myself as much as him. Kaido raised an eyebrow. That's it. That's not nothing, I said, getting defensive in the way people get when they know they're about to lose an argument. Do you know how good it feels to be chosen by someone like that? Someone who could have anyone she wants, and she picks me. But even as I said it, I could hear how hollow it sounded. Because being chosen isn't the same thing as being valued, and being wanted isn't the same thing as being loved. Though I wouldn't figure that out for another year and a half, when I'd be sitting alone in an expensive restaurant for 4 hours, finally understanding the difference between being someone's choice and being someone's option. That night, lying in my own bed next to someone who'd never actually asked to share it, I started doing something I told myself was just a weird habit from work. I began saving things, screenshots of texts, voice notes, little moments where Sloane's sweetness would slip and something sharper would show underneath. I told myself I was just being organized, keeping records the way I did with project timelines and contractor communications. But the truth was, I was already building evidence for a case I didn't know I'd need to make. Some part of me, buried deep under all the rationalization and wishful thinking, was keeping receipts for the life I was pretending I wasn't actually living. You know that saying about red flags looking like flags when you're wearing rose-colored glasses? Yeah, well, I wasn't just wearing rose-colored glasses. I was wearing rose-colored glasses, a rose-colored hat, and apparently a rose-colored blindfold, because I managed to miss warning signs that were bigger and brighter than a Vegas casino billboard advertising the apocalypse. The thing about Sloane was that she had this relationship with the word no that can best be described as allergic. Not just mildly uncomfortable, not just preferentially avoidant, but full-blown, breakout-in hives. Call the paramedics allergic. The woman could not handle being told no about anything, ever, by anyone, and I learned this the hard way through a series of increasingly uncomfortable episodes that I somehow managed to rationalize as passion and knowing what she wanted. Take her manager situation, for instance. This was maybe 2 months into the whole living arrangement that dare not speak its name, and Sloane had missed a deadline for some campaign she was working on. Not a huge deal, right? People miss deadlines sometimes. Life happens, priorities shift. Sometimes the dog eats your homework and you're stuck explaining to your boss why the quarterly marketing report looks suspiciously like chew toy remnants. But instead of just owning up to it like a functional adult, Sloane decided that the appropriate response was to record a 2-minute voice note that she sent to her manager at 11 o'clock at night. And because we were sharing our lives now, she played it for me like she was sharing a particularly amusing TikTok video. Marcus. The recording began, and I could already hear the venom dripping from her voice like honey mixed with battery acid. I got your email about the deadline, and honestly, I'm pretty disappointed in your leadership style right now. Calling out a team member for missing one tiny deadline when the client keeps changing their mind every 5 seconds makes you look like a clipboard clown who cares more about checking boxes than actual results. A clipboard clown. She called her manager, her boss, the person who signs off on her paychecks and performance reviews, a clipboard clown. I'm sitting there on the white leather couch that had replaced my perfectly good furniture, watching her pace around my living room like a caged tiger, and she's looking at me like she expects me to applaud this masterpiece of professional communication. Can you believe he had the audacity to question my time management? She said, flopping down next to me with the dramatic flair of someone who just survived a great injustice. I've been busting my ass on this campaign, and he's worried about some arbitrary deadline that doesn't even matter because the client is going to change their mind again anyway. I should have said something. I should have pointed out that calling your boss a clipboard clown might not be the best career strategy. I should have suggested that maybe, just maybe, when you miss a deadline, the appropriate response is, sorry, my bad, won't happen again, rather than launching into a character assassination disguised as feedback. Instead, I said something like, that does sound frustrating, because I was still operating under the delusion that being supportive meant agreeing with everything she said, even when what she said was completely insane. She saved the voice note to her phone, and somehow, without really thinking about it, I found myself saving a screenshot of our text conversation where she'd sent it to me first. Just habit, I told myself. The same way I saved important project communications at work. Totally normal, nothing weird about keeping records of your girlfriend's professional meltdowns. But the manager thing was just the appetizer in the all-you-can-eat buffet of Sloane's inability to handle being told no. The main course came a few weeks later when her mother had the absolute audacity to refuse to co-sign a lease for some boutique space that Sloane wanted to rent. Now, I should probably mention that Sloane had been talking about opening her own marketing boutique since about week 2 of her temporary stay at my place. It was going to be this amazing creative space where she'd help local businesses find their authentic voice and tell their story in a way that resonates with their target demographic. Noble goals, right? Except that her business plan seemed to consist entirely of rent expensive space in the trendy part of town and figure out the rest later. Her mother, Mrs. Lawson, who seemed like a perfectly reasonable human being from the brief phone conversations I'd overheard, apparently had the nerve to suggest that maybe Sloane should wait until she had more experience, or perhaps start smaller, or possibly have an actual business plan before committing to a lease that cost more per month than most people's mortgage payments. Sloane's response to this maternal wisdom was to record another voice note, this one clocking in at nearly 3 minutes of pure, concentrated fury. She didn't send it to her mother directly. Oh no, that would have been too honest. Instead, she sent it to me like I was her personal emotional dumping ground, with the message, "Can you believe this? I cannot believe how small-minded my mother is being right now." The recording began, and I could hear her pacing around the apartment, her voice getting higher and more strained with each word. She acts like she's being financially responsible, but really she's just scared of success. She's scared that I might actually make something of myself instead of settling for some boring suburban life like she did. It went on like that for 3 full minutes. Her mother was small-minded. Her mother was holding her back. Her mother didn't understand entrepreneurship. Her mother was projecting her own failures onto her daughter's dreams. By the end of it, you would have thought Mrs. Lawson had personally set fire to Sloane's hopes and dreams instead of simply declining to co-sign a lease for a business that existed only in theory. "It's just venting," Sloane said when she saw my expression. "Everyone needs to blow off steam sometimes. I don't actually mean it. But here's the thing about words. They don't become meaningless just because you label them as venting afterward." And the way she said those things about her mother, the specific cruelty of calling someone who raised you small-minded because they won't bankroll your poorly thought-out business fantasies, that doesn't just evaporate because you claim you didn't mean it. I saved that voice note too, and the screenshot of her sending it to me, and the follow-up texts where she continued to rant about her mother's lack of vision and fear-based thinking. I told myself I was just keeping track of things the way I did at work, maintaining records for future reference. But really, I was starting to build a collection of evidence for something I couldn't quite name yet. Meanwhile, I was becoming the world's most dedicated fixer. Not in the cool, Harvey Keitel and Pulp Fiction way, but in the pathetic, enabling way that slowly erodes your sense of self until you're not sure where your problems end and someone else's problems begin. When Sloane complained about not having the right clothes for important meetings, I found myself offering to pay for a shopping trip. When she mentioned wanting to take some professional development courses, but not having the budget, I somehow ended up covering the tuition. When her resume needed polishing to better reflect her unique skill set, I spent my weekend using my professional contacts to help her rewrite it in a way that made her sound like a marketing genius instead of someone who'd missed deadlines and called her boss a clipboard clown. And through it all, I was watching her treat service workers like they were personally responsible for every minor inconvenience in her life. The waitress who took too long to refill her water glass got the eye roll and the heavy sigh. The barista who made her latte with regular milk instead of oat milk got a lecture about attention to detail. The delivery guy who buzzed our apartment instead of just leaving packages in the lobby got a passive-aggressive comment about following simple instructions. Each incident was small on its own. Nothing that would make you call the behavior police or stage an intervention. But they added up like drops of water wearing away at stone, each little moment of casual cruelty chipping away at my ability to pretend that this was normal, that this was just how passionate people expressed themselves when they were frustrated. My neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, who lived in 4A and had the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from watching people make the same mistakes for 70-plus years, caught me in the hallway one afternoon as I was carrying up 3 shopping bags full of groceries and what looked suspiciously like another expensive handbag. "Adrian," she said in that gentle way that immediately lets you know someone's about to tell you something you don't want to hear. Can I share something with you? Mrs. Okafor was the kind of person you listened to when she wanted to share something. She'd raised 6 kids, been married for 47 years before her husband passed, and had the kind of perspective that only comes from surviving enough life to see the patterns that repeat themselves across generations. Of course, I said, setting down the bags because something in her expression told me this wasn't going to be a quick hallway exchange. A person who despises small people will never treat big love kindly, she said, and the words hit me like a gentle slap to the face. The way someone treats a waitress, or a delivery person, or their own mother when they think no one important is watching, that's who they really are, not the performance they put on for people they want to impress. I stood there in that hallway, surrounded by bags full of stuff I'd bought for someone who treated our neighbor's wisdom like an inconvenience, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not enough to change anything, not yet, but enough to plant a seed of doubt that would eventually grow into something I couldn't ignore. She has high standards, I said, because apparently I was still committed to making excuses for behavior that didn't deserve excuses. Mrs. Okafor smiled the way people smile when they've said what they came to say and know that's all they can do. High standards for how people treat her, maybe. But what standards does she have for how she treats other people? I picked up those shopping bags and carried them upstairs to my apartment that no longer felt quite like mine, where Sloane was waiting to tell me about her day and all the various ways the world had failed to meet her expectations. I put away groceries I'd bought, organized them in cabinets that housed dishes I washed and cookware I used to make meals for people who critiqued my efforts like they were doing me a favor by eating them. And that night, as I was putting away the expensive handbag that was apparently necessary for some networking event that would advance her career, I found myself wondering when caring for someone had started to feel like a part-time job I hadn't applied for but couldn't quit. I was still saving the voice notes, the screenshots, the little pieces of evidence that painted a picture I wasn't ready to look at directly. My phone had become an archive of red flags that I kept folding up and putting away like laundry, telling myself I'd deal with them later, when I had time, when it was convenient, when I could figure out what they meant. But deep down, in the part of my brain that was still functioning independently of my heart's misguided optimism, I was starting to understand that I wasn't collecting these things randomly. I was building a case. Here's the thing about being someone's financial savior. It feels really good right up until the moment you realize you're not their hero. You're just their ATM with feelings and a credit score they can exploit. It was a Thursday evening in October when everything went sideways, and I should have known something was up because Sloane had been unusually quiet all day. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that couples develop when they're secure enough to exist in the same space without constant conversation, but the loaded kind of quiet that feels like a gun that hasn't been fired yet. She'd been checking her phone obsessively, typing messages and then deleting them, pacing around the apartment like she was rehearsing for a performance I wasn't supposed to know about yet. Then her dad called. Mr. Lawson was one of those genuinely decent guys who made you understand where Sloane had gotten her charm, even if she'd weaponized hers in ways that would have horrified him. He was a retired postal worker, the kind of man who still believed in handshakes and thank you notes, and showing up 15 minutes early to everything. When he called, his voice was shaking in that particular way that means a grown man is about to cry and trying really hard not to let it happen. "Sloane, sweetheart," he said, and I could hear him through the phone because she'd put him on speaker like she always did, turning private family conversations into public performances. "I need to talk to you and Adrian about something, and I'm not sure how to say this." That's when I learned about balloon payments, which is apparently what happens when you get a mortgage that seems affordable for a few years and then suddenly turns into a financial horror movie where the monster jumps out and demands a massive lump sum that you definitely don't have. The Lawsons had bought their house 12 years ago with one of those adjustable rate mortgages that seemed like a good idea at the time. Lower payments for the first few years, manageable monthly amounts that fit their budget when Mr. Lawson was still working full-time and Mrs. Lawson was bringing in steady income from her job at the school district. But now the balloon payment was due, and they needed to come up with $68,000 in the next 6 weeks or lose the house they'd been living in for over a decade. "We tried to refinance," Mr. Lawson explained, his voice getting smaller with each word. "But with me being retired now, and Linda only working part-time. The banks won't touch us. Our credit's good. We've never missed a payment. But apparently that doesn't matter when you don't have enough income to qualify for a new loan. I was doing the math in my head while he talked, running through my savings account, my emergency fund, my retirement contributions. It would be brutal, but it was possible. Barely possible, requiring me to liquidate basically everything I'd saved over the past 5 years and probably take out a personal loan for the difference. But theoretically doable if I was willing to put myself in a financial hole that would take years to climb out of. But before I could even process what I was thinking, Sloane was already turning to me with tears in her eyes that seemed to appear with the magical timing of a Broadway actress hitting her mark for the spotlight. "Adrian," she whispered, reaching for my hand like she was drowning and I was the only life preserver in sight. "If we help them now, they'll finally see me for who I really am. They'll understand that I'm not just their flighty daughter who can't stick to a budget. I'm someone who can solve problems, who can take care of family." The way she said "we" should have been my first clue. Not you, not "would you consider," not even "do you think it's possible," but "we." Like my bank account had somehow become community property during the Great Couch Replacement incident, and I'd missed the memo about joint finances. "We can do this," she continued, squeezing my hand with just the right amount of pressure to convey both desperation and confidence. "I know it's a lot of money, but it's family. It's the right thing to do. And imagine how good it will feel to know we saved their home." There it was again. "We." Like she was going to be writing half the check. I looked at Mr. Lawson's face on the phone screen, saw the shame and fear and desperate hope all mixed together, and I made the kind of decision that feels noble and selfless right up until you realize you've been played like a cheap guitar at a pawn shop. "Let me run the numbers," I said, and I spent the next 2 hours figuring out exactly how to destroy my financial stability in service of someone else's family emergency. The math was ugly. I'd have to drain my savings account completely, cash out most of my 401k, and take the early withdrawal penalty, and get a personal loan for about 15 grand to cover the rest. It would set me back years in terms of retirement savings, cost me thousands in penalties and taxes, and leave me with basically no financial cushion for emergencies. But it was doable. "I can make it work," I told them, and Mr. Lawson started crying actual tears of relief while Sloane kissed me like I'd just offered to move mountains with my bare hands. The paperwork took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of coordinating with banks and loan officers and financial advisors who all looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I explained what I was doing. 3 weeks of Sloane telling everyone who would listen about how her amazing boyfriend was saving her parents' house, how I was stepping up to be the kind of man who took care of family, how lucky she was to have found someone with such a generous heart. When the check finally cleared and the Lawsons officially owned their house free and clear, Mrs. Lawson hugged me so tight I thought she might crack one of my ribs. "You gave us years of breathing," she whispered in my ear, and for a moment, it felt like maybe I'd done something genuinely good with my life. Mr. Lawson shook my hand with both of his, looking at me like I'd personally delivered him from financial ruin, which I guess I had. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you for this," he said, and I could see that he meant it, that he was already trying to figure out ways to show his gratitude that would somehow match the magnitude of what I'd done. "You don't need to repay me," I said, because at that moment, seeing their relief and joy, it felt like the truth. "We're family now." But here's where the story takes a left turn into the kind of territory that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the person sharing your bed. The very next day, literally 24 hours after I'd signed over the better part of my financial future to save her parents' house, Sloane was having drinks with Trent, Harper, and Naya at some trendy rooftop bar that charged $18 for cocktails that came in mason jars. And because she'd started including me in the group text thread where they planned their outings, I got to read in real time as she described my mortgage heroics to her friends. "Adrian finally did the bare minimum for family," she wrote, and I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. The bare minimum. $68,000, and the complete destruction of my financial security was the bare minimum. "Honestly, it took him long enough to step up," she continued. "I was starting to think he wasn't serious about us, but I guess better late than never." Trent's response was a series of laughing crying emojis followed by, "Maybe next time he'll spring for a second house, so they can have a vacation home too." Harper added, At least now you know he's not completely selfish. Progress. And Naya, sweet oblivious Naya, chimed in with, "That's so romantic. Nothing says true love like a mortgage payment." They were all laughing. About my financial sacrifice. About the fact that I gutted my savings account to help people I barely knew because the woman I loved had asked me to. About the bare minimum gesture of giving away money I'd spent 5 years saving. I sat in my apartment. The same apartment where Sloan was living rent-free, eating food I bought, sleeping in a bed I paid for, and I stared at that group text until the words started to blur together. I screenshotted the whole conversation and saved it to the growing folder on my phone that I was still pretending wasn't evidence of anything important. That night, when Sloan came home smelling like expensive cocktails and overpriced appetizers, she curled up next to me on the white leather couch and told me about her evening. "The girls are so impressed with what you did for my parents," she said, running her fingers through my hair like she was petting a dog that had performed a particularly clever trick. "They said I'm really lucky to have found someone so generous." I wanted to ask her about the bare minimum comment. I wanted to know how $68,000 qualified as taking too long to step up. I wanted to understand how my financial sacrifice had been transformed into a story about her good fortune in finding someone who would eventually do what was expected. Instead, I said something like, "I'm glad they approve," because I was still operating under the delusion that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the relationship. But late that night, lying next to someone who described my most generous act as barely adequate, I started to understand that I wasn't building a life with someone who valued my contributions. I was funding a lifestyle for someone who saw my sacrifices as the entry fee for the privilege of her company. The mortgage payment had felt like love in action. Turned out, it was just the cover charge for a show where I'd never be anything more than the guy in the audience, applauding someone else's performance of my own life. So here's how my birthday dinner became a masterclass in public humiliation, served with a side of expensive wine that I got to pay for while being roasted like a Thanksgiving turkey in front of a restaurant full of strangers. It started 3 weeks before the actual day, when Sloan announced that she was planning something really special for my 31st birthday. Not asked if I wanted something special, not suggested we might do something nice together, but declared with the authority of someone who'd appointed herself the director of my life events that she was taking charge of the celebration. "I've been thinking," she said, curled up on the white leather couch that had replaced my actual personality, "and you deserve something amazing this year. You've been working so hard, and after everything you did for my parents, I want to show you how much it means to me." She'd picked Meridian, which was this fancy-ass restaurant downtown that we used to drive past on our way to normal people places, the kind of spot where they don't list prices on the menu because if you have to ask, you probably can't afford to eat there. The kind of place that had a waiting list longer than most people's attention spans and required reservations made with the same level of planning usually reserved for space missions. "I know it's expensive," she said, running her fingers through my hair in that way that usually preceded requests for money. "But it's your birthday, and you only turned 31 once. Besides, after the mortgage thing, everyone knows you're responsible with money, so one splurge won't hurt." The way she said, "responsible with money," while suggesting I blow a week's salary on dinner was the kind of cognitive dissonance that should have set off alarm bells loud enough to wake the dead. But I was still operating under the delusion that love meant saying yes to things that made you uncomfortable if they made the other person happy. So I made the reservation for 8 p.m. on a Saturday, which meant calling in a favor with a client who knew someone who could get us a table. I bought a new suit because Sloan mentioned that this isn't really a jeans and button-down kind of place. I got my hair cut at an actual salon instead of the barbershop I usually went to because she suggested I should look the part for such a nice evening. By the time my birthday rolled around, I'd spent more money on the preparation for this dinner than I usually spent on food in 2 months. But I told myself it was worth it because Sloan was excited. And when someone you love is excited about making you happy, you don't complain about the cost of admission to your own birthday party. I showed up 15 minutes early because that's what you do when someone makes an effort to plan something special for you. I wore the new suit, complete with the tie Sloan had picked out, and I felt like I was playing dress-up as the kind of person who belonged in places like Meridian. The hostess was one of those impossibly elegant women who made small talk feel like a performance art, and she led me to a table that had a view of the city lights and probably cost more per hour than I made in a day. Will anyone else be joining you this evening? She asked, arranging my napkin with the kind of precision usually reserved for origami competitions. Yes, my girlfriend should be here soon, I said, checking my phone to see if Sloane had sent any updates about her arrival time. Running late. Go in and get seated, her text said. Order me a glass of the Pinot Grigio. I'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes turned into 45. 45 turned into an hour. The hostess started making return visits to check if I needed anything, and I could see the pity starting to creep into her professional smile. The waitress, a young woman named Jessica who was probably working her way through college, kept refilling my water glass with the kind of determined cheerfulness that made it clear she'd been trained to handle awkward situations with grace. Would you like to order an appetizer while you wait? Jessica asked after the first hour had crawled by like a wounded animal. I'll give her a few more minutes, I said, because optimism is apparently a terminal condition that I hadn't been properly treated for. By the second hour, other diners were starting to notice. I could feel their eyes on me, the solo guy in the expensive suit sitting at a table for two, checking his phone every 30 seconds like it might magically produce an explanation for why he was dining alone on what was clearly supposed to be a special occasion. The couple at the table next to me kept shooting concerned glances in my direction, the kind of looks you give to wounded animals on the side of the road. Hour 3 was when the pity really ramped up. Jessica had moved beyond professional politeness into genuine concern, asking if I was sure everything was okay, if there was anyone I needed to call, if maybe I'd like to order something to eat instead of just sitting there looking like a man who'd been stood up by his own life. She's just running really late, I said, maintaining the fiction that this was a minor delay rather than a complete abandonment. She'll be here soon. But I was starting to feel that special kind of humiliation that only comes from being publicly reminded of your own foolishness. The kind that makes your face hot and your chest tight, and your brain starts spinning out scenarios where you're the villain in someone else's story about why they couldn't be bothered to show up to the thing they planned. By hour 4, I had memorized every detail of that restaurant. The way the light caught the wine glasses at the bar. The pattern in the wallpaper that probably cost more per square foot than most people's rent. The sound the ice made when it shifted in my water glass, which had become the most reliable companion at my table for one. That's when Sloane finally arrived. But she didn't arrive alone, and she definitely didn't arrive apologetic. She swept into Meridian like she was making a grand entrance at a movie premiere, trailing her holy trinity of enablers, Trent, Harper, and Naya, behind her like she was a celebrity, and they were her entourage. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my new suit. Her hair was perfect, her makeup was flawless, and she was laughing at something Trent had said as they approached the table. She didn't even sit down before she delivered the line that would replay in my head for months afterward. See? She said, gesturing at me with a grin that could have cut glass. Told you he'd still be here like a pathetic dog. The words hit me like a physical slap. The table behind me, the couple who'd been shooting me sympathetic looks for the past 4 hours, went completely silent. The ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade into a ringing in my ears that made everything sound like it was happening underwater. Trent burst out laughing, that braying sound that people make when they're more interested in showing approval than expressing genuine amusement. Jesus, Sloane, he really is well trained, he said, sliding into the chair across from me like he belonged there. Harper was recording something on her phone, probably a story for Instagram about their fabulous night out, while Naya just looked uncomfortable, like she couldn't quite decide if this was funny or cruel. Adrian, honey, Sloane said, finally acknowledging my existence beyond the dog comparison, you look so serious. It's your birthday, you should be having fun. She reached over and squeezed my cheek like I was a child who needed to be cheered up, then turned to Jessica, who was standing there looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. He's watching his belly, so just water for him tonight. But we'll take a bottle of your best champagne for the table. I sat there, still wearing the suit I'd bought for this occasion, still at the table I'd reserved for what I thought was going to be a romantic dinner for two, and I watched Sloane hold court like she was the star of a show that I was paying to watch. They ordered appetizers and entrees and dessert, ran up a bill that would probably cover my grocery budget for 2 months, and the whole time I was invisible except when they needed someone to make jokes about. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, though that was pretty spectacular. The worst part was the moment when I realized that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding or a plan gone wrong. This was intentional. Sloane had planned this exact scenario. The 4-hour wait, the grand entrance with her friends, the public humiliation disguised as a birthday celebration. She had orchestrated my own emotional demolition like it was dinner theater. I memorized the shape of my wine glass that night. The way the light refracted through it, the weight of it in my hand, the sound it made when I set it down on the table. Because sometimes, when your world is falling apart in real time, you focus on small, concrete things to keep yourself from completely losing your mind. When the check came, and of course it came to me, because apparently being called a pathetic dog doesn't exempt you from paying for the privilege, I smiled. I ordered another drink. I paid for my 2 beverages and let them figure out the rest. And then I walked out of that restaurant and into the kind of clarity that only comes from being publicly humiliated by someone you love. The night air tasted like freedom, even though I didn't know it yet. The bathroom at Meridian had the kind of lighting that was designed to make you look like a movie star, but somehow it just made me look like a man who'd been emotionally mugged in public. I stood there staring at my reflection. Expensive suit, perfect haircut, face that looked like it had been slapped by reality and was still processing the sting. For hours, I'd sat in that restaurant for 4 goddamn hours like a trained seal waiting for someone to throw me a fish, and when she finally showed up, the fish was poisoned and served with a side of public humiliation that probably violated some kind of Geneva Convention about cruel and unusual punishment. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Once you hit it, the view becomes crystal clear. All the bullshit that looked like love from a distance suddenly comes into focus, and you realize you've been staring at a mirage this whole time, dying of thirst while convincing yourself you were drowning. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the evidence I'd been collecting without really admitting I was collecting evidence. The voice notes were all there, filed away in a folder I'd labeled Sloane stuff, like I was keeping track of grocery lists instead of documenting a slow-motion character assassination. There was the clipboard clown, recording where she'd eviscerated her manager for the crime of expecting her to meet deadlines. I played it back, listening to her voice drip with contempt for someone who was just trying to do his job, and I wondered how I'd ever convinced myself that this was just someone venting frustration, instead of revealing their true character. Then there was the 3-minute masterpiece about her mother being small-minded for refusing to co-sign a lease for a business that existed only in Sloane's imagination. I'd heard it so many times I could recite it from memory, but listening to it now, in this bathroom that cost more to design than most people make in a year, I could finally hear what I'd been ignoring. This wasn't someone having a bad day. This was someone who genuinely believed that anyone who didn't give her exactly what she wanted was either stupid, selfish, or both. And then there were the texts. Oh, the beautiful, damning texts that painted a picture so clear I couldn't believe I'd been squinting at it for over a year. The group chat where my mortgage heroics had been described as the bare minimum. The private messages where she called Trent a barnacle who drinks my shine, while laughing at his jokes to his face. The casual cruelty directed at everyone from waitresses to delivery drivers to her own parents, all saved in neat little digital files that told the story of who I'd really been sharing my life with. I thought about Mrs. Okafor's words. A person who despises small people will never treat big love kindly. Standing there in that overpriced bathroom, staring at my reflection while my girlfriend held court at a table I was paying for, surrounded by friends who thought watching me get humiliated was prime entertainment, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. This wasn't about one bad night. This wasn't about a birthday dinner that went sideways or a joke that didn't land right. This was about 4 years of systematically training myself to accept less and less respect while providing more and more resources, emotional and financial, to someone who saw my generosity as weakness and my love as something she was entitled to rather than something she should cherish. The guy in the mirror looked tired. Not just physically tired from sitting in a restaurant for 4 hours being treated like furniture, but soul tired from carrying the emotional weight of someone who'd never carried anything heavier than her own purse. He looked like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be valued, who'd gotten so used to being the supporting character in someone else's story that he'd forgotten he was supposed to be the protagonist of his own life. I texted Zuri, "Can you be outside in 10? My sister had been waiting for this call for 4 years. She'd never said, "I told you so." Never pushed too hard. Never made me feel stupid for loving someone who treated me like a convenience store that happened to have feelings. But she'd been there, watching me shrink myself down to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be, probably holding her tongue through 1,000 conversations where she wanted to shake me by the shoulders and remind me of who I used to be. I straightened my tie, the expensive tie that Sloane had picked out for the birthday dinner she'd turned into performance art about my own pathetic devotion. I looked at myself one more time, really looked, and I made a decision that felt like waking up from a 4-year nap. I was done being anyone's pathetic dog. I walked back to that table where Sloane was still holding court, where Trent was still making jokes at my expense, where Harper was still documenting their fabulous night out on social media, where Naya was still looking uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to say anything. I smiled at them, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes but covers a multitude of sins. "I need to make a quick work call," I said, because even in my moment of awakening, I was still too polite to cause a scene in public. I walked to the host's stand, where the elegant woman who'd seated me 4 hours earlier was trying very hard not to look like she'd witnessed a tragedy. I paid my tab. Just my tab, the 2 drinks I'd nursed through 4 hours of public humiliation. "The rest is theirs," I told her, nodding toward the table where my soon-to-be ex-girlfriend was living her best life at my expense. Then I walked out into the night air that tasted like the first breath you take after nearly drowning, and I finally understood the difference between being someone's choice and being someone's option. I'd been an option for 4 years, and I was done auditioning for a role in a show where I'd never be anything more than comic relief. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, I was about to serve up a 5-course meal that had been chilling in my phone for months, and every single bite was going to be ice-cold truth served on a silver platter of Sloane's own words. I got home around midnight to an empty apartment that suddenly felt like mine again. The white leather couch looked different somehow. Less like a monument to someone else's taste, and more like evidence of how thoroughly I'd let someone else redecorate my entire existence. But I wasn't thinking about furniture. I was thinking about that drawer in my desk where I keep everything organized, the same methodical approach to record-keeping that had made me good at my job and apparently excellent at documenting my own emotional demolition. I opened my laptop and started pulling threads, not breaking into anything, not hacking accounts or crossing any legal lines, just using what Sloane had already given me access to. The streaming accounts I'd been managing because she found all that tech stuff annoying. The cloud storage I'd set up when she complained about running out of space on her phone. The email address I'd helped her create for her boutique applications, complete with the password she'd asked me to remember because she couldn't be bothered with keeping track of another login. Funny how someone who treats you like personal tech support never stops to consider what kind of access they're handing over. The voice notes were all backed up to the cloud, organized by date like a timeline of casual cruelty. I had 4 years of evidence sitting there. Every rant about managers who expected professionalism, every character assassination of family members who wouldn't bankroll her dreams, every private conversation where she revealed what she really thought about the people she smiled at in public. I started with her manager, Marcus the clipboard clown, found his email in her contacts, opened a new message, and attached the voice note where she'd spent 2 minutes explaining why expecting employees to meet deadlines was basically fascism. No commentary, no explanation, just her own words in her own voice, delivered directly to the person they were about. "Here's what your employee really thinks about your management style," I wrote. Simple, factual, devastating. Next up was Mrs. Lawson. Sweet Mrs. Lawson, who'd hugged me so tight after I paid off their mortgage, who'd whispered, "Thank you," like I'd saved her life, who had no idea her daughter had spent 3 minutes calling her small-minded and fear-based for the crime of being financially responsible. I attached the voice note to an email and wrote, "I thought you should hear what Sloane really thinks about your decision not to co-sign her lease." But the piece de resistance was for Trent, the barnacle himself. Mr. He's well-trained, who'd spent the evening laughing at jokes about my pathetic devotion while having no clue that Sloane had described him in private as a barnacle who drinks my shine. The same Trent who showed up every Friday to eat food I cooked and critique my hospitality like he was doing me a favor by gracing my living room with his presence. Since you seem to enjoy laughing at other people's expense, I wrote, I thought you might appreciate hearing what Sloane says about you when you're not around. 3 emails, 3 voice notes, 3 people about to discover that the person they thought they knew had been performing a completely different character for their benefit. Then came the part that felt like surgery, careful, precise, necessary. I went through every shared account and switched it back to just me. Netflix, Hulu, Spotify, Amazon Prime. All the little conveniences that had somehow become ours when they'd always been mine. I removed her access to my credit cards, canceled the reservations I'd been funding for restaurants and events and experiences that were apparently just opportunities for her to practice her contempt. But the clothes were what really drove the point home. 4 years of designer outfits, expensive handbags, shoes that cost more than my monthly car payment. All bought with money I'd earned and stored in closets I paid rent for. I started packing, and it was like excavating an archaeological site of my own financial stupidity. Every item told a story. The dress from when she needed something special for a work event, the handbag that was essential for networking, the shoes that were an investment in our image. 16 garbage bags. That's what 4 years of someone else's lifestyle looked like when you stripped away the romance and looked at the receipts. 16 heavy bags full of fabric and leather and metal hardware that had somehow been transformed into evidence of my love and generosity, when really they were just proof that I'd confused being an ATM with being a boyfriend. I kept the important stuff separate: IDs, documents, family photos, anything that was actually irreplaceable. I'm not a monster, just someone who was done being treated like one. Zuri showed up at dawn with her pickup truck and the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from watching someone finally take out their own trash. You sure about this? She asked, looking at the mountain of garbage bags piled by my front door. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I said, and for the first time in years, that was actually true. We drove to the county dump in silence, the radio playing softly while the sun came up over a landscape that looked like possibility. When we got there, I watched a hydraulic compactor mash 4 years of fake luxury into anonymous debris, and it felt like watching someone else's life get compressed into the truth. Expensive garbage is still garbage. How do you feel? Zuri asked as we drove home through morning traffic that looked like freedom. Like I just took out 4 years' worth of trash, I said. She smiled. About damn time. My phone started buzzing at 7:12 a.m., and it didn't stop for the next 12 hours. By noon, I had 278 missed calls and enough text messages to write a novel about the many creative ways people can beg, threaten, and bargain when their world suddenly catches fire from the inside. It started with Sloane, of course, because when you've spent 4 years being someone's personal crisis management team, they naturally assume you'll be available to manage this crisis too. The first few calls came rapid fire, back to back, the kind of frantic dialing that happens when someone realizes their safety net has developed holes they never noticed. When I didn't answer, the texts began. And watching them evolve in real time was like getting a masterclass in the 5 stages of grief, compressed into digital format and delivered with the manic energy of someone whose carefully constructed facade had just collapsed in spectacular fashion. Stage 1 was anger. What the hell did you do? Answer your phone right now. Stage 2 was bargaining. It was a joke, Adrian. You know I was just kidding around. You're being dramatic. Stage 3 was confusion. What did you send to my mother? She won't stop calling and crying. Stage 4 was panic. Why is HR calling me? What did you do at my job? And Stage 5? Well, Stage 5 never came, because acceptance would have required Sloane to acknowledge that her own words had consequences, and we were apparently nowhere near that level of personal growth. I made tea like it was a meditation. Earl Grey with honey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes, the same way I'd made it every morning for the past 5 years before someone else's chaos had started dictating my daily routine. I opened the curtains that had been closed more often than not during the Sloane era. She'd complained that morning light was aggressive and interfered with her sleep schedule, so I'd gotten used to living in dimness that matched my emotional state. The apartment looked different in actual sunlight. Cleaner, somehow. More spacious without all that designer debris cluttering every surface. The silence felt good, not empty, but full of possibility, like a blank canvas waiting for me to remember what I actually wanted to paint on it. Mrs. Okafor slipped a note under my door around noon, written in the careful handwriting of someone who'd learned cursive when it was still considered a necessary life skill. If you need food or quiet, knock. No questions, no judgment, just the kind of unconditional support that comes from people who understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop accepting unacceptable behavior. Around 2 p.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on my door like they were trying to break it down with their fists. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know it was Sloan. The rhythm was pure entitlement mixed with desperation, the kind of knocking that says, "I know you're in there, and I have a right to your attention." I sat on my couch. My brown corduroy couch that I'd rescued from storage after the white leather monstrosity had disappeared along with everything else, and I listened to her work through what sounded like the entire emotional spectrum in the span of 10 minutes. First came the demanding, "Adrian, open this door. We need to talk about this like adults." Then the pleading, "Please, just let me explain. You don't understand what you've done." Then the bargaining, "I know you're angry, but think about what we have together. Think about everything we've built." And finally, the card slipped under my door like a white flag of surrender, except it wasn't actually surrendering anything. I planned a surprise after the laughter. Why ruin everything? A surprise. After 4 hours of public humiliation, after calling me a pathetic dog in front of a restaurant full of strangers, after turning my birthday into performance art about my own devotion, there had apparently been a surprise waiting that would have made it all okay. The audacity was almost impressive. Zuri texted me a photo from the dump, the compactor crushing what looked like a designer handbag into unrecognizable fragments. The caption read, "Closure looks like this." I screenshotted it and added it to my growing collection of evidence that sometimes the best revenge is just refusing to participate in someone else's delusion about reality. But the call that really got to me came around 8 p.m., after most of the chaos had died down to a manageable roar. Mr. Lawson's number appeared on my screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. This was the man whose mortgage I'd paid, whose gratitude had felt so genuine that I'd convinced myself it was proof that good deeds were always rewarded with good people. "Adrian," he said when I finally picked up, and his voice sounded like it had been put through a blender. Not angry, not accusatory, just broken in the way that comes from discovering that someone you raised isn't who you thought they were. "Mr. Lawson," I said, because even in the middle of burning down my old life, I still had manners. "I don't know what to say," he continued. I heard what she said about Lindo and me. About the mortgage, about being small-minded, about..." His voice cracked, and I realized I was listening to a father's heartbreak in real time. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Whatever else had happened, Mr. and Mrs. Lawson didn't deserve to discover their daughter's true feelings about them through a revenge email from her ex-boyfriend. "No," he said firmly. "No, don't you apologize. Thank you. Thank you for helping us when we needed it, and thank you for showing us who our daughter really is. I'm ashamed, Adrian. I'm ashamed of what she did to you, and I'm ashamed that we raised someone who could treat another person like that." He paused, and I could hear him breathing heavily, like he was trying to decide whether to say the next part. "I'll come get her important documents tomorrow," he said. "Alone. She's not welcome in my house until she learns how to treat people with basic human decency." After he hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and realized that sometimes the truth doesn't set everyone free. Sometimes it just shows people who they really are, and not everyone is ready for that revelation. But I was ready. For the first time in 4 years, I was completely, absolutely ready to be myself again. Watching someone's carefully constructed social empire crumble in real time is like watching a controlled demolition in reverse. Instead of everything falling down in a neat, predictable sequence, it's chaos spreading outward in all directions, taking down innocent bystanders and revealing the structural weaknesses that were always there, hidden behind a pretty facade. The first domino fell at Sloan's office, where Marcus the clipboard clown had apparently decided that listening to a 2-minute voice note about his management style was exactly the kind of feedback he needed to take immediate action. I found out about it through the professional grapevine. One of my clients knew someone who worked in Sloan's building, and word travels fast when someone gets called into HR for what basically amounted to a recorded confession of workplace insubordination. She got walked out. My contact told me over coffee, the way people share gossip that's too good not to spread, but too brutal to enjoy completely. Security escort and everything. Apparently, the voice note was just the cherry on top of a sundae they'd been building for months. Missed deadlines, attitude problems with clients, the whole 9 yards. The recording just gave them the excuse they needed to pull the trigger. I should have felt bad about that. I should have felt some twinge of guilt for potentially costing someone their livelihood. Even someone who'd spent 4 years treating me like a combination ATM and emotional punching bag. But honestly, all I felt was a kind of cosmic justice, like the universe had finally decided to balance the books. The boutique situation collapsed next, and that one was almost poetic in its swift brutality. Apparently, the lease she'd been so desperate to have her parents co-sign had involved meeting with some local business networking group. The kind of people who take reputation seriously and don't appreciate discovering that their potential new member had described family members as small-minded for refusing to bankroll what was essentially a vanity project with no business plan. We've decided to pursue other candidates for the space. The email read, according to Sloane's increasingly frantic text messages that I was screenshotting for my own entertainment. We feel it's important that our business community reflects the values of respect and professionalism that our neighborhood is known for. Translation: we heard your voice note, lady, and we don't want that kind of toxic energy anywhere near our strip mall. But the real satisfaction came from watching her social circle implode like a house of cards built on a foundation of mutual bullshit and artificial loyalty. Trent was the first to crack, and honestly, I should have seen it coming. When you build your entire personality around being the guy who makes cutting remarks about other people, finding out that someone's been making cutting remarks about you is like discovering your favorite weapon has been pointed at your back the whole time. The barnacle who drinks my shine comment had apparently hit him right in his oversized ego, because within 48 hours of receiving that voice note, Trent had gone from Sloane's biggest supporter to her most vocal critic. I heard about it through Harper, who had apparently decided that loyalty was optional when it came to someone who'd been talking shit about all of them behind their backs. He's telling everyone who'll listen that she's a fake and a user. Harper had texted me, and I could practically hear the glee in her digital voice. Says he always knew something was off about her, but kept quiet because he felt sorry for you. The revisionist history was almost impressive in its completeness. Suddenly, everyone had always known that Sloane was trouble. Everyone had seen the signs, but hadn't wanted to interfere in my relationship. Everyone had been secretly rooting for me to wake up and see what was right in front of my face. It was bullshit, of course. These were the same people who'd sat in my living room every Friday night, eating food I cooked and drinking wine I bought, laughing at Sloane's stories about difficult customers and unreasonable managers and small-minded family members. They'd been her audience, her enablers, her willing participants in the performance of her own victimhood. But now that the performance had been revealed as a lie, suddenly they were all critics who'd seen through the act from the beginning. Harper's Instagram pivot was particularly entertaining. One day she was posting group photos from their fabulous girls' nights, and the next she was sharing vague, inspirational